The final presentation in this session, we'll proceed now with Professor Salengaros, who will talk about life and the geometry of the environment.
My topic is a very Greek topic, not because of the identity of the presenter, but because it ties into the fascination of classical Greece with geometry in a very mystical way. And I will try to tie in two ancient Greek concepts of geometry. One, the Greek rationalism, the frightening rational analysis of the world that the ancient Greeks are responsible for, and at the same time, the irrational. And when I refer to the irrational, I wish to refer to the mystery, the wisdom, the appreciation of the sacred that Metropolitan of Pergamon pointed out very nicely yesterday. So today, the irrational can be said to be what we fail to explain using our more advanced mathematics. We have made tremendous progress in understanding complex geometries in the last 10, 15 years that were impossible before. So things like complex systems, fractal scaling, etc., symmetries, enable us to understand patterns in nature and patterns of human life and human behavior that were impossible to understand before. We see these patterns, the complex geometry, in natural structures and, of course, more importantly, in biological structures. This commonality of a specific complex geometry in biological structures makes it easier for us to include ourselves, human beings, within the biological structure, and thus creates a commonality and a bond that does not exist from a strictly rational point of view that has been current of the last 200 years since the Industrial Revolution. So if we take this seriously, and this is taken seriously not because of philosophy, but because of scientific advances in the very last few years, then we establish a fundamental healing connection between the body, the human body, and its environment. The biophilic effect claims that natural environments nourish us. This is an observed experimental effect. For example, post-operative healing is remarkably enhanced by being in a natural environment, having access to a natural environment. It is not well understood why this is so. We can guess why this is so, because we ourselves have evolved in a natural environment. We are part of the natural environment. Our human intelligence makes it so easy to forget, makes us detach ourselves from nature, and therein lie some of the greatest catastrophes of the human race. But I don't want to get into that now. I want to get into the artificial environments, because we have been so successful as a species, we humans, that we have constructed all over the world. And do these artificial environments nourish us? This is an extremely important question. The ancient Greeks had a method of architecture and city planning that nourished the citizens and nourished the users. So the environments that we build are emotionally and psychologically and physiologically healing if they embody traditional design techniques that imitate nature. This is something that we discover from traditional architecture. We had the discontinuity that occurred in architecture and urbanism with the introduction of mass production, and the question that I do not particularly agree with, nevertheless has importance here, because of the ideology that the machine society introduced. I'm not against the mechanization, but mechanization introduced a pseudo-religious ideology, so that has created a new worldview. And it's a crude mechanistic worldview, because when we think of mass production, we think of Henry Ford and Taylorization at the beginning of the 20th century. This is crude by the most incredible standards, machine production and and the first type of industrialization. But somehow this created the worldview that mass production and industrialization in itself is an important part of the future. But at the same time, it negates the complex mathematical properties of nature, which show us an infinitely more complex basis for our very existence. That's bad enough, and I could discuss that. But even worse, I want to go further. It reduces nature to a simplistic mechanical view of a simplistic machine itself. And at the same time, it detaches human nature from the biosphere. So we are now facing a global environmental crisis and biological crisis, precisely because we have detached human nature from the biosphere. This is not easy to solve. I am involved in many projects and so we review proposals, and invariably these are technological proposals for how to save humankind from its own errors, heading for ecological destruction. But the technological destructions are still coming within the system. What I'm proposing is that we need a solution to come from outside this simplistic mechanistic worldview. So we need to rediscover the biological interaction between people and sensory space. We have always had a community living outside or thinking outside the simplistic mechanistic worldview. These are philosophers who are not enamored with machines. However, the arguments that they have used, being non-scientists, tend to be non-scientific and have been dismissed by the mainstream society, which is scientific. For the very first time now in several decades, we can have a convergence of these viewpoints. So we can enhance the quality of life through the geometry of the built environment by understanding what it is that makes a nurturing environment. So I wish to distinguish the nourishing from the anxiety-inducing environmental information, and this is information that comes through our sensory system. I wish to criticize in the harshest possible manner the nightmarish sustainable cities, in quotations, and the urban projects built by today's fashionable architects that rely strictly upon high consumerist, global consumerist, high technological solutions, because those technological solutions may be efficient within the existing technological society, but are highly fragile and unstable if we come closer and closer to the end of cheap fossil energy. So I wish to propose 5 points for regeneration. We need access to clean air, water, shelter, and living space. This is a parallel to Maslow's points for good living. We need access to biophilic information in plants and animals. I'm not saying this now as a romantic point of view. I'm saying this now scientifically. We have a biological need for the information because it affects our health in a positive way. Thirdly, we need access to biophilic information in texture, color, ornament, and art. Much of this Congress has discussed classical Greek theater, visual arts, sculpture. That's number 3. Everything that classical Greece produced in sculpture and art and dance and music is contained in part 3. It is an essential part to human beings. It was an essential part of classical Greek society. It was an essential part continuing through Byzantine years. Yet today we tend to ignore it. Well, here is the contradiction. Conferences like this discuss the necessity of the classical Greek artistic heritage, whereas in day-to-day life, we build buildings that have absolutely no ornament, no color, nothing. It's again, we're coming back to this mechanization and the machine aesthetic as a substitute religion, which is the dangerous part of mechanization. And fifth of all, coming back, this is now going back to Maslow, we need protection from anxiety-inducing objects. So, for example, this takes us to urbanism that protects us from cars and that creates a semi-protected pedestrian environment. Again, something that's lacking, and since I'm in Athens here, I will say the urbanism of Athens is forgetting that the best parts of Athens, the most livable parts of Athens, have a restricted pedestrian environment. And the new parts of Athens just have thrown all that away to copy the most inhuman of the American suburbs, and with ensuing catastrophic results. So before it is too late, someone has to take notice of that. Fortunately, I'm not connected to the Greek government, so I don't have to make these hard decisions. So connecting to a place, the connection is achieved through our senses and through actions that humankind has developed, like dance, music, art, and architecture, but a special type of architecture that does connect. So the properties that do connect include the patterns, the regularity, repetition, nesting, hierarchy, scaling, and fractal structure. And here I should include symmetry. I do not include symmetry because when we talk about symmetry, and even throughout this conference I have heard symmetry mentioned in a misleading manner. I do not imply large-scale reflectional symmetry. I imply a vast number of subsymmetries. It is what we physicists consider. The subsymmetries, the more subsymmetries they are, they tie the form together. We see that in physics, in the structure of matter. We see that in biology, in the genetic structure. We see that in art, in the classical Greek art. We see it in the architecture, a vast number of subsymmetries. So the word symmetry by itself has to be interpreted in the original meaning and the meaning that we have discovered from physics and biology. So connecting to a place comes from demonstrable geometrical patterns and not mystical properties. At the same time, I want to emphasize that we need to respect that which we don't understand. And when I talk about biophilia, it is a very, very recent concept. We have scientific information that proves that the effect is there and we can measure it. However, we don't totally understand it. We should respect something that we observe, yet we cannot totally explain. The arrogance of some narrow-minded scientists of our times is that what they cannot explain entirely, they tend to dismiss. And that's where we need to go back to learn from the classical Greeks, because they had the notion of the sacred, something that they knew existed that prevented them from the most terrible mistakes against their own persons and their society. Yet it was not rational. There was the irrational part, but it counterbalanced the rationality. Anything that could be explained rationally, fine, that formed a body of knowledge, but there were other things that were equally as important, that were irrational, and they were judged because they improved the quality of life. That's what we're talking about. Something that improves the quality of life, even though you cannot explain it, yet you understand how to apply it. It becomes part of the tradition, and it is incorporated into the philosophy, into the religion, into the culture of the society. Now, I'm going off in a different direction. If we have an architecture that denies the mathematical qualities that enhance the quality of life, then those buildings evoke anxiety. I'm not going to mention any examples, but there are some consequences, very dire consequences. There is an instinctive reaction against these buildings that usually turns into hostility against the sponsor. The sponsor could be a private company. The sponsor could be identified in a certain political class. So the next time there is a political instability in a country, then the percentage of the population that is frustrated turns against the political class that has sponsored monumental inhuman buildings. I'm going further into dangerous territory. If a certain global economic alliance sponsors these inhuman, anxiety-inducing buildings all over the world, then dispossessed in the rest of the world will form an alliance of hatred against the sponsoring entity. And we can see what that leads to, global terrorism that we may say wrongly identifies certain political entities as hostile, but the hostility is a visual message coming from the architecture. And the people who build these buildings, they think they're building a very fashionable, very modern, beautiful, fashionable building that's in style by a very expensive architect. Yet they're setting up the targets for political attack and a terrorist attack. Now, to get to my conclusion, to give some positive guidelines for constructing a human city, the living city encourages movements. We have forgotten that. We have forgotten, I'm not saying that my group of friends who design cities, society as large, has forgotten the human body and its movements. The human body itself has a range of scales, 1 millimeter to 2 meters. And the pedestrian movement and our daily movements go from 2 meters to 1 kilometer. And the priority should be placed on the smaller scales because that's the personal scale, the human body. We must design a city so that a coherent system of movements and actions can take place on different range of scales. This will enable the dance of life to take place. So the living city creates a geometrical framework out of inanimate matter, building blocks and beams and sidewalks and roads, that if the geometry is correct and it's complex enough, the dance of life, which is the movement and the day-to-day living of human beings, is welcome and it develops. We do not create the dance of life, it is the human beings that create the dance of life, and this then gives rise to a quality of life in that particular neighborhood if we remove other things like the economic conditions, which we cannot control, or crime, which we cannot control, but at least that portion of a city allows our organism to have a positive feedback that enables the quality of life. Now, just in Athens, you can identify which portions of Athens have that quality of life because of the geometry, and which portions of life, especially in the more wealthy regions, have no quality of life. Because all the money in the world cannot change the geometry. If the geometry is bad, then you're confined either to your house, or you go downstairs to the garage, you get into your SUV, and you have to go somewhere else in order to enjoy quality of life. You cannot go outside and enjoy that quality of life. It's strictly the geometry. So to conclude, the quality of life depends in part about nourishment from the environment. I think most people will tend to agree with that. It does not totally depend upon energy consumption. These go hand in hand. There's a dualism between my 2 points here, and I want to emphasize point 2 because so many people are arguing about reducing energy consumption, but the arguments given are logical economic arguments, whereas I'm giving arguments that have to do with the quality of life that come from the geometry and from the biology of human beings themselves. In order to do this convincingly, however, we have to fight the global consumerist society, because the global consumerist society has for decades been using a vast propaganda machine to convince people of an imaginary link between the quality of life and energy wastage. This is a fraud. And this panel would like to introduce the notion that there is no such link, and that the quality of life depends upon the geometry of the environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Salingaros, for that good timing. A question that has come in over the internet that I think is appropriate to introduce now. It deals considerably with economics, and we've just had several presentations on that topic. So I'll put this out to the committee, to the panel. The question is, given that industrialization and mass production have diminished quality of life nowadays, do we as a society need to take a step forward in inventing new ways of living, or a step backwards by returning to habits of past centuries? How willing are people to change a comfortable lifestyle in order to achieve the quality that they need?
I do not agree with the statement of the question that mass production, industrialization have decreased the quality of life. Yes, they have. But it is rather the religious or pseudo-religious aspect of industrial production that are responsible for reducing the quality of life. Industrialization is capable of enhancing the quality of life if it is tied in to wisdom and producing objects and enhancing the everyday life of people, but not promoting this crazy consumerism. So there is more than one aspect to this question. So if we're wise in the future, we can turn the productive capacity, stop polluting and destroying the earth, and creating products that will actually increase the quality of life.
Nikos, I have a question for you, and I totally agree with your science and your philosophy. I thought some of your statements, though, were rather aggressive in saying that architects design buildings that turn people into terrorists or turn them into feeling very angry about their lives. Because I look around and I see so many people who I have known personally who might have much preferred to be in a house that was of a Christopher Alexander design, but on the other hand, they seem to be very able to deal with the fact that they aren't able to. For example, you told me your home in San Antonio was in a suburban place, that it wouldn't be where you'd like to be, but you seem to be doing quite well, prospering as a professor and an intellect. So could you comment on why you take those very strong stands?
Very, very well.
The strong opinions are meant to be provocative and to give rise to more research, precisely in the field that I'm working in. Because architecture has been on a certain track for several decades, where a certain type of minimalist design has been desired and has been repeated all over the world. It takes a lot of provocation to get people to start thinking about whether this minimalist design is desirable or not. So I'm not going to get a large enough number of people to think about changing this or investigating the actual basis of the physiological basis of design unless people are provoked enough.
Bob?
Do you think that is it a demand problem or a supply problem? In other words, is the biggest challenge to change schools of architecture so that they realize the underlying principles of geometry and life, or is it more a problem that the demand is driving that rather than the supply?
At the present moment, I would say there's a problem of supply. A certain ideology seems to be common to the majority of architectural schools, and they sell a certain product which is consistent with 20th century, actually early 20th century ideals of aesthetics in architecture, and that is what is available. There is demand, but if an architecture student today wishes to study the architecture that we advance, they can hardly go to any of the present architecture schools. There are only one or two architecture schools where they can go in order to study the type of architecture that I propose. So what they wind up doing is to study privately with one of my friends.
Bob, can I add a comment? As someone who teaches in architecture schools, I can both defend them and to some extent join in Nikos's criticism. I think we all get into our silos. There's the old, adage about if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. So we ourselves have to be careful about overemphasizing the role of the built environment in people's well-being and so on. But on the other hand, I think the evidence that's coming out now is actually confirming the fact that the built environment does play a profound role in our well-being and our quality of life in ways that we aren't often aware of. And you mentioned the example of living in a suburban environment that you might not want to be in, and you just muddle through, and we all muddle through in various buildings that we live in and so on. And yet there is apparently a measurable decline, maybe not a lot, maybe there's a lot of other factors, but there is a degradation that comes from that, and a loss of productivity and all the other things. And it seems to me it sort of reinforces the larger question about that I alluded to earlier about how we're joining up these issues in a larger process of addressing sustainability, or how maybe we're not joining up these issues, and that's maybe the challenge we face.
I do think that we're moving to an era where as the world population urbanizes and we're encouraging more compact development, it's very important that we still have nature, not just in the geometry of the built environment, but pure nature, because we're seeing now more and more medical experts talking about nature deficit disorder. In their mind, that means there are not enough parks and natural landscapes as opposed to managed landscapes, and that's affecting people in many ways, especially children, but the healing of people, as I think Nikos mentioned or you mentioned in your talks. So how we find that balance between keeping people's access to real nature versus managed nature is going to be a challenge in this
And it's both, as you say. I mean, it's the access to real nature, but also the quality, as Nikos described, in the built environment, the biophilic quality, which we tend to polarize these things and say, oh, well, we just leave the city and go out into the park for a while, as opposed to understanding that there's parts of the built environment that have the same kind of geometric contribution to our well-being.
Other questions or comments from members of the panel?
Yes, I'm still bothered, Robert, by your question about the resentment against minimalist architectural forms. And now that you mentioned the internet, I would like to link two things together. Michael Mahaffey and I wrote a controversial paper about 8 years ago, trying to explain, in part, the hostility felt by the Islamic world towards the industrialized West in terms of modernist urbanism and architecture. And it was provocative, and it has been translated in Persian and published in Iran, and evidently is distributing through the internet throughout the Arabic world. Now, the distinguished British philosopher Roger Scruton was also taken by it, and he used that as one of the bases for two books trying to explain the same problem, the hostility that the Islamic world feels towards the industrialized West. Those two books are The West and the Rest, and the Virtues of Pessimism, a recent book by Roger Scruton. So there is something there. It's outside the reach of this conference. But since we know that at a different time, the Hellenistic period, Western ideas and technology went to the pre-Islamic world. And aside from the damage we did in Iran, which I wish to apologize to the Persians today, we actually brought some very good things to what is now the Islamic world. I'm not sure that we can say the same thing today with the commercialization and the westernization that has gone into the Islamic world. So this requires a separate new conference, but our paper with Michael, I think, touched a very raw nerve, and I hope, again, it was meant to be provocative and to try to think of a new understanding from the viewpoint of the Islamic mindset, which values traditional geometries, and traditional geometries in the Islamic mindset is a sacred geometry. There is no separation of the sacred from the analytical geometric. And for them, it is more serious, far more serious than we are talking about it today, because we're all Westerners.
I think that's an incredibly important point, that all of the technologies that have so much promise, and we've heard about several of them here today, certainly all have a double edge to them, one very positive and one potentially very negative. And I would certainly agree that now we tend to have so much momentum behind letting these technologies move forward without real consideration of moral issues associated with some of these, that in part relates to our economy and the way it works. The money is all flowing towards the side of let's expand the technology, and there's very little funding for philosophers to really spend a significant amount of effort talking with people and spreading a different, not necessarily a different message, but a different way of thinking about these technologies. So I think we do have issues. We're We're nearing the end of our session, but I would like to pose another question, and that is, one of the things you note in all academic institutions, higher institutions, is that visual products are now being used by every single discipline. If you go to a campus, you can go from medicine to economics, to earth science, to physics, and we see over and over again visual products being utilized to communicate. And I wonder if there's some way in which this gives us an insight into a way to avoid fragmentation or begin to reduce fragmentation with visual communication across our disciplines. Can anybody help me with that?
Yes, Michael Mahaffey's lecture today presented the patterns of Christopher Alexander, whereby invariant geometrical qualities are found throughout nature and also in very abstract processes. We had no time to investigate that, but I'm sure that there is a great deal of detail in Michael's paper on the internet. So visual communication succeeds in many different disciplines because of these patterns that resonate with our sensory system, which has evolved within nature, and our sensory system is extremely well attuned to resonate with natural structures. Now, so what you say absolutely makes sense. Let me bring now a counterexample of a very unfortunate thing that happened. In the 1950s in mathematics, there was a dark period in mathematics when the Bourbaki school eliminated all diagrams from mathematics texts. And this happened in France. It was done by a team of French mathematicians, whom I don't like. And the worst thing is that they blamed it on a Greek mathematician, Nikolaos Vourvakis. But it happens that Nikolaos Vourvakis is a fiction. He was a general 100 years before that. But these French mathematicians took the name of Nikolaos Vourvakis and called themselves the Bourbaki school. And so for about 30 years, a whole generation of all French mathematics was done without diagrams. And it took the courageous Russian school of mathematicians to reintroduce beautiful diagrams, which they did with a vengeance. And that's why we had a tremendous flowering of Russian mathematics from the 50s to the 80s, because the books are full of diagrams.
Thoughts from the artist about how we might move forward? Maybe we need to have an artist in every academic department to inform people how to produce better visuals.